We're so thrilled to have Brent back in Silva this evening. It's been a few years since he's had a book out. He's some of you that are familiar with his writing may think of him more as a poet, but he does a fine job with essay too. He'd previously done that was it hunting camellias and catfish.
Horseshoe bends. Hunting catfish at horseshoe bends.
But tonight he's got a sort of an expanded collection that he's going to tell us about. These essays on journeys, past and present.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks, everyone, for coming out tonight. I don't really know how to introduce this book, except just to say that I've worked on these essays for years. Some of these essays have been published. Hey, guys, good to see you guys. They're essays that kind of span about probably maybe 12-year period of living in Cowie Valley, which is, some of you might know Cowie Valley, because it's all done. Wow, in the east. Wow. Yeah, just seeing familiar faces all of a sudden. And so a lot of it's just my early years spent living in Cowie Valley and living in the Little Tennessee Valley. Mainly, a lot of this kind of comes out of just an obsession with William Bartram. Bartram is kind of woven throughout this collection. It's kind of hard for me not to talk about Bartram. I've been on a 3-day intensive workshop on Bartram that I just got through literally at about 4:30 this afternoon, and drove down from the Highlands Plateau to do this reading. So I'm kind of toast right now. 3 8-hour days of teaching William Bartram. I probably will start speaking in rhapsodic, effusive 18th century language at any moment. I don't know. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe we all need to start speaking in that language again. So I was kind of wrestling with what to do tonight. I've only done one other reading so far with this book. So I thought, I was emailing my wife coming down. We had an emergency house sitting gig we had to do for my sister this weekend, so she had to take off and take care of some dogs. So I sent her a text message and I said, well, what the hell am I going to read tonight? What should I do? And so she said, read this essay I wrote, this book called Pushing Through, which really is an essay I wrote after leaving Silva. You know, it was a long, great kind of 10-year run I had here in this town, working for the Wilderness Society. And, you know, I left here under painful circumstances. And this essay called Pushing Through is really a kind of a cathartic moment I had several months after leaving Silva and leaving the Wilderness Society, which, you know, it's an essay that's painful for me to read, but it's an essay that I feel like I need to keep reading publicly in order to kind of continue to purge myself of the feelings I have and the emotions, the trauma that I had suffered, you know, losing my job here. And, you know, hey, Lawrence, great to be able to do this. Unfortunately, you know, I hope that I don't lose it, because I'm doing it on Avram Friedman's YouTube channel, so that's see what happens there. But you know, honestly, it's not all it's not all about despair. There's a lot of what I consider to be kind of deeper commitments to the idea of wildness, the idea of wilderness, the idea of living in a world that may be without wildness at some point, and what that means. I like what John Lane said here about how he plans to give this collection to a few friends who will love it, and mail it to a few assholes who desperately need its salvation, wisdom, and light. So I appreciate John for being so candid about that, because I feel the same way. There's a few things I'd like to do with this book, and I'm sure you all would too, to a few people we all know. But anyway, this essay is called Pushing Through, which I wrote several months after leaving Silva and leaving the Wilderness Society and going to one of my favorite places in the park, which is the Three Forks area. A truly wild part of the park, you know, one of the wildest parts of the park left, if not the wildest place in the eastern United States left, in an extremely difficult place to get into. Really inaccessible, extremely remote part of the park. Some of you might have seen Ted Alexander's book called Mountain Fever, which he wrote about about exploring that part of the park for Ravensford Lumber Company. George Massa, the photographer, spent time in that part of the park and photographed it. Ted Alexander, at one point, you know, there was actually an old manway, as they called it, that went down to the park, through that part of the park that Massa and Alexander would go down to and have fishing parties and stay for days at a time. You go to Three Forks and you know you've been somewhere. So I wrote this essay after a very, very, very difficult experience in that part of the Great Smokies, and it's called Pushing Through. So I will, I'll do my best to get through this without choking up. We'll see how that goes. 2:30 a.m. Thicket Branch, Great Smoky Mountains National Park, late September 2017. I have been walking since 9 a.m., though walking is no way to describe the last 10 hours. It has been crawling, pushing, climbing, and scrambling through the densest rhododendron I've ever seen in my life. And I've seen a fair amount. Prior to that, I waded 3.4 miles up to the East Fork of Raven Fork, within one of the wildest pieces of country left in the eastern United States. It was a leisurely wade fishing for native brook trout through an old-growth red spruce forest where enormous hemlocks have succumbed to hemlock woolly adelgid, choking the stream at times and forcing us to perform limbo and various acrobatic feats. We had no idea what to expect when we exited the stream at 4:30 p.m., thinking we would bushwhack our way up to the ridgeline above us and walk the 3 miles back down to campsite 44 where we had backpacked to the previous afternoon. Brook trout in this high elevation stream appear as ghosts from the light of my headlamp, blue, translucent. Maybe they are. I could be hallucinating after so much exertion, and I still have no idea when we will make it back to camp, or if we will. I'm beyond fatigued and have been dehydrated for the last 6 hours. In my near delirium, I think of this as another metaphor for the last 3 months of my life. Today we left our camp at McGee Spring and bushwhacked our way down to the East Fork of Raven Fork, much as we did last year, though instead of heading downstream to Three Forks, where these three streams form a great pool amidst high elevation old-growth spruce forest, we head upstream to country we have not ventured to before. It's a trip I've needed since losing my job in May, a job I believe would sustain me into retirement, and a job I'd given my all to with people I believed in. At 58, this is nothing to be taken lightly, and so heading into some of the most rugged terrain in the eastern United States was something I believed I needed to get grounded again in after depression and outright despair. A close friend and past hiking companion who is 94 calls me a few days before I leave and pleads with me not to go alone. He's a retired neurologist and knows me well. I just learned yesterday his wife's dying, so that was a real sorry. He's concerned about my depression and knows that people often come to this park to die, like wild, sick animals, leaving their kin to pass away quietly and without attention. I assure him I'm not that depressed, and then I will contact a friend who I've hiked with many times before joining me. Campsite 44, McGee Springs. A high elevation campsite amidst old growth spruce fir forest at the dead end of the trail with nothing but wildness before me. Here alone I sit, a box of wine and a journal, red-breasted nuthatches and golden-crowned kinglets singing in the spruce. A raven circles over twice, so close I can hear its wings flapping in the clear September sky. Happy, feeling lighter than I have in months. I write of what is around me and am grateful for the moment. My planned solo trip is now aborted as I wait for another close friend, Herman Walker, who has explored this part of the park with me before and knows the difficult terrain. He is likely beginning his hike up from Round Bottom Road as I write and will be here in a few hours. Drink this in, I think. Take it all in, as much as possible. The air, the smell of spruce, the wine, the insects I observe beneath my hand lens. There is no trail up Raven Fork, only flowing water, boulders, log jams, dead hemlocks and spruce, and dense and ever-present rhododendron flanking it all. We spend over 7 hours traveling 3.4 miles up this holy and untouched place. This large part of the park was never logged due to its inaccessibility, and its magnificence is stupefying, Jurassic. I remarked to Herman at one point that I expect to see dinosaurs or a Bigfoot emerge at any moment. It seems that incongruous with the world I have just departed from. For most of the days we fish. Herman is either upstream or downstream from me, always within shouting distance, he with his dry flies and consistent enthusiasm for catching native brook trout, and me alone with my constant ruminations and rage. The beauty of the place and the occasional brook trout I reel in all soften the feelings. But the feelings are as present as always. I want to purge them and explode into this place, to be one with its power, which is beyond my comprehension. I've always felt outraged by injustice, but this is the first time in my life I've experienced it in such a direct and life-impacting situation. It never quite leaves my consciousness. I dream about it, write about it in my journal. I wake in the middle of the night and think about it. And as much as I want to will a new life and a new self, it refuses to leave. I know it will take time. So all day now, while staring into the gin clear water and exploring gravel bars, I've been thinking about how a major conservation organization that I'd given over 10 years of the best years of my life to threw me under the bus because two rich funders wanted something I couldn't deliver on. I've dealt with rich funders all of my life, so that was nothing new. I'd just never seen how one individual could work so effectively to undermine the efforts of another solely because he had wealth. Not competence, wealth. This individual disagreed with the outcome of a collaborative effort that took over 2 years to negotiate, and for the next 2 years he worked to destroy it, and he did. The organization I worked for had initially supported the effort and outcome and praised it nationally as a model. So did the 40-plus organizations that had been part of the process. But when this individual, who had never been part of the process and who represented only himself, found out about the process and outcome, he immediately went to the biggest conservation funder in North Carolina and convinced him that it was a bad outcome. I shake my head a lot, my wife tells me, and I catch myself doing this as I wade upstream thinking. At 4:30 p.m. we decided it was a wise time to stop and head back to camp. We clean a dozen brook trout, put them in a Ziploc with wet moss, and look at the steep slope above us that we must climb to get to the summit of Hyatt Ridge. Neither of us having done this before, we assume it will be easier than wading the stream back to McGee Springs. We've made these types of journeys before, and though the forest above us appears dense with rhododendron, we aren't intimidated by it. We'll push through it to the ridge and stroll on back to camp. I take the fish, and we both decide that we don't need to purify more water, as we both have a little and consider it enough for the hike back, which we think we can do in 2 to 3 hours. Wading a mountain stream for 7 hours is no easy task, and we are a bit tired and beat up, but are in good spirits and conditioned to this. We joke about the bourbon back at camp, wish we'd brought it, and begin the climb. After an hour, we've made little progress. The rhododendron is dense and snarled together. We must crawl, climb, and force our way through it with great energy being expended. After 3 hours, we are becoming dehydrated and have not even gone a mile. It is getting dark, and I'm feeling a bit uneasy as I look at the GPS unit and see how much farther we have to go, with no sign of the rhododendron letting up. I drink the water out of a tuna package, eat my last 2 carrots, and stare into the tangle. At 1 a.m., and having not yet made it a fourth of the way back to camp, we are both approaching exhaustion and feeling desperate for water. It is slowly sinking in that we are not going to make it back to camp this way tonight, and that we've got to get to water. We find a blue line stream down the ridge on the iHike app that Herman has on his iPhone, and with his dying battery, we begin descending through snarls of rhododendron that are seemingly without end. At almost 2 a.m., we find the stream, and after filling ourselves in our bottles, I attempt to talk Herman into spending the night. We have matches, but there's little to burn but rhododendron, and besides, Herman is convinced that in our condition we are ripe for hypothermia and will find ourselves unable to go on if we rest. I agree somewhat reluctantly, as I fear that sooner or later one of us is going to take a bad fall. It is treacherous beyond belief, and as we peck our way down thicket branch, the stream grows, and we soon find ourselves delicately clambering down waterfalls and over and under enormous down spruce trees that span the stream. I'm trying not to become angry. This was a trip that I'd wanted for myself since losing my job in May. I wanted the park for solace, inspiration, and self-renewal, and here I am now thinking that I could die. Irony begins to sink in, along with the liberating idea that all my anger and frustration over the past summer has been an illusion. I began to think of other ironies. My first trip into this park alone was the summer I turned 18. I had just graduated from high school, and I was largely friendless at the time. High school was not pleasant for me. In my senior year, my abusive stepfather became worse. drinking heavily and taking his frustrations out on me and anyone else he could lash out at in our household. I worked every day from 5:30 to 9:30 p.m. at United Parcel Service, loading and unloading trucks, and after work smoked weed and drank heavily to cope with it all. The stepfather left around the time of my graduation, but it was too late. I had withdrawn and found my only solace in the forest behind our house, the one that had saved me so many times before. While others in my graduating class went on to celebratory cruises or drove to Daytona Beach for drunken revelry, I worked even more, planning my own getaway to backpack across the Smokies, following the Appalachian Trail to its starting point in Georgia. I knew nothing of backpacking, only that I wanted the experience and was willing to try. My mother drove me to Cosby Campground on the east end of the park and left me with inadequate gear and a mind full of darkness. I was caught in an August thunderstorm almost as soon as she left. It didn't end, and after a few hours of hiking through it wearing a cheap poncho and without a cover for my pack, I was completely soaked, as was all of my gear. With dark coming on, I realized that I'd missed the trail that would take me to a point on the Appalachian Trail where my first backcountry reservation was made. I had no tent, only a small tarp, and I soon realized that I would not make it to the shelter. I'd gone miles out of my way, and there was no going forward. I slept wrapped in the tarp while the rain fell, tired but still full of determination to make my destination almost 200 miles away. The experience of surviving this night out alone and the subsequent trail challenges changed me. I came home more confident and more in love with wild places than ever before. The irony that I'm here in this park now 40 years later with much more experience but in a somewhat similar condition does not escape me. In my pack is an eagle claw fishing rod that accompanied me on that teenage trip, and I have treasured ever since, only using it for these deep excursions in the park. Much like that night, tonight I want to bed down in the dry woods and sleep a deep and fatigued sleep and hack our way out once daylight arrives. But we push on, falling often, carefully clambering downstream toward the East Fork of Raven Fork. 2 years ago, Herman lost a brother to an avalanche in the Cascade Mountains. And though I say nothing, I can't help but think that this must be on his mind, pushing him onward toward his wife, children, and grandchildren. It is certainly pushing me onward. I'm also aware that a few people out there are worried about me. I reflect on the conversation I had with Bob before leaving, worrying now that the friend he wanted me to go with and I might die or become seriously injured in one of the most rugged places in the eastern United States. I can't help but think about my original intent to come here alone, to sit among the old growth spruce with a journal and pen and some small volumes of poetry and decompress. Not to push myself harder physically and mentally than I ever have in my life. Unless I'm hallucinating, I'm looking at what might be a national champion red spruce. What a gift to experience wonder in the midst of mild terror. And the brook trout, small, blue, and seemingly translucent in the weakening halogen headlamp. How did it all come to this? I stagger on. At a certain point in my self-loathing for getting myself into this, I attempt to shift my perspective. Maybe this is exactly what I need, pushing myself through this hell of rhododendron as a metaphor for a personal catharsis, this falling and stumbling and crawling my way through this dark night toward dawn, and comfort far off at the moment, but not impossible. We reach the East Fork of Raven Fork at almost 4 a.m. and rest on a gravel bar where Thicket Branch enters the river. We pump more water and both remark upon our states of dehydration, which we attribute to adrenaline. This is the part of our journey I have feared the most. Difficult by day, I can't imagine what it will be like in darkness as our headlamps fade and we along with them after 12 hours of bushwhacking from our departure, not far from upstream from where we are now. With the GPS unit now dead, we must pay careful attention for the point where McGee Spring enters the East Fork, as this is our only known route back to Hyatt Ridge and camp. If we miss it, we will no doubt spend the remainder of this night somewhere down in this gorge, and we'll have to wait until daylight. We remember a flat spot on the west side of the river that was not far from the spring, and once we see it, we begin scanning the bank on the east, hugging it close, and looking for a small piece of orange flagging that we had found earlier that day. I find it in the spring soon after, and though utterly exhausted, I feel as if I could spring up the steep and muddy mountainside for the half mile we must cover to make it back to camp. When we arrive at camp at 5:30 a.m., I am so tired that I'm disoriented and wander about uncertain as to where the tents are, and consider that I'm possibly lost somewhere in the upper reaches of McGee Spring. I find my tent at last, collapse inside, and wake 5 hours later and check my body for damage. I'm still exhausted and have to hike 4 more miles out with a heavy pack. I decide to get up now and go for it while the adrenaline is still pumping. I have a half pint of Jack Daniels, and after packing in a quick breakfast, I put it in my pocket and begin the walk. Herman is awake, and we share a cup of coffee as he packs up. He is in good spirits despite the obvious fatigue and exhaustion, and for almost 70, amazingly mobile and unfazed. I'll leave him packing and start the slow trudge towards the trailhead. I'm glad to be alone, sipping whiskey and confident about getting out and home. I don't even know what condition I'm in. I'm that tired, but I'm going home. Home to Epsom salts and deep sleep, and a step further toward release from the self-inflicted torture I've imposed upon myself for months. After recovering for a couple of days, I email a good friend who documents champion trees and tell him about the spruce and thicket branch. He immediately tells me that old growth sleuth Will Blozan documented the national champion red spruce there several years ago, but no one had ever been able to verify it. This doesn't surprise me. Then I break out in a horrific rash. Every scrape and cut on my body, and there are many, becomes irritated with something that looks like poison ivy, though that isn't what it is. But what is it? My scientific explanation, based on internet research, is that I am toxified by exposure to rhododendron. My pharmacist, I think it might have been you, Jerry, tells me it is not poison ivy, and Herman, who is allergic, says that he is not broken out. Besides, he says, we never saw poison ivy. It's rarely present in rhododendron. I considered another metaphor with literal expression. I'm releasing all the emotional poison I have built up in me from the last 5 months. Do we really repeat our past throughout life, and are we structured psychologically to do so until we learn to move on? I'm no good at this. I have no life experience to call upon to point me in another direction. I've dealt with divorce, a bipolar child who suffered through years of addiction, work challenges of every sort, a difficult and traumatic childhood, but I've never had to call upon myself to rise again like I am now. Within a week after I return, a package in the mail arrives from a friend. In it are copies of Pema Chodron's When Things Fall Apart and Paul Kingsnorth's Confessions of a Recovering Environmentalist. I'm familiar with Kingsnorth's work and have been reading his essays and novels for several years. He's a critic of the environmental movement and its obsession with sustainability. The sustainability argument is closely linked to those advocates of the Anthropocene and its emphasis on our ability as humans to think our way out of the mess we're in. We're on top, the argument goes, and smart enough to figure out things with the natural world. We can control it, bend it to our will, and perhaps most importantly, fix it. Fix it with our technology and human wherewithal. Kingsnorth puts his bets on the nature bat's last philosophy, and I'm with him. Central to his message is letting go of hope in these dark times. Retreat and immerse yourself in the ecological grief of our era and find the art and creativity that is necessary to respond. Engaged withdrawal. Kingsnorth's message is for the individual seeking a way to cope with what is happening on a global scale today, but Chodron's message is for the individual caught in his or her own web of personal despair and hopelessness. I'm seeking escape from my own anger and desires, caught up in my hurt ego and longing for revenge. Her message hits me hard. To think that we can finally get it all together is unrealistic. To seek for some lasting security is futile. Believing in a solid, separate self, continuing to seek pleasure and avoid pain, thinking that someone out there is to blame for our pain, one has to get totally fed up with these ways of thinking. Hopelessness means that we no longer have the spirit for holding our trip together. It's all suffering. It's all despair. And the sooner I can accept this, the more beautiful and sadder it all becomes. I know I have to let go, that I can't keep going on at this age with such feelings of rage and emptiness. I love the world and the temporality of it all. And despite my long visit to the dark side, I see the light. I can emerge and find a new path. The world's always been this way. All right, so I'm going to, thank you. I'll read a really brief, just like, piece of an essay just to get us out of that weird funk I just dropped us all into. Okay. All right. So let's see. This is a little more, got some humor into it. Lift us up a bit. This is an essay that I wrote several years ago. It was weird. I was talking to someone about, I think, Trish and Doug about this earlier. Several years ago, been some time ago, I took the Orion Society has a bread loaf writers workshop every year, and I took that workshop, and this was an essay that came out of that workshop, and I could never find a publisher for this essay. It was really weird because I really, that's just the way it goes. I kind of liked the essay, but it just wasn't sticking somewhere. There was no home for it, so I was glad to finally see it in this little collection. So I'll just read a couple of pages of this. This is called Fish Transformation and Thinking Like an Osprey. It is late February, and my wife and I are sitting in an ancient skiff a couple of miles off the coast of southeastern Costa Rica. From my view to the west, jungle meets ocean on both sides, both north and south sides of the grimy little surfer town of Puerto Viejo, where Condoca Forest Reserve and Cahuita National Park serve as bookends, respectively. Puerto Viejo, where dreadlocked white American surfers patrol the streets when not out searching for the perfect wave, is our base for this area, where the natural and cultural worlds run together in a tapestry as thick as the Spanish mackerel schooling about our boat. Our fishing guide, Earl, is one of the local Afro-Caribbean natives of this town, who also owns the noisy and jumping late-night Neptune bar. His assistant, a local Bree Indian, speaks no English and can barely understand my faltering Spanish. When it is time to move on to the next location, he attacks the prehistoric Evinrude motor with a flurry of pulls and prayers. There are no life preservers, and the bottom is an inch deep with water, where our bait swims in dizzy and nervous circles, dodging our hands as we reach down to grab a fresh one for our hooks. Earl is smoking an enormous joint, drinking a Cerveza Imperial and singing Bob Marley songs. It is maybe 9 a.m. He occasionally looks at us and tries to shove the joint our way. My wife looks at me cautiously. This is a look she has mastered in our 12-year marriage that is ignored to my certain peril. She has also mastered the art of catching Spanish mackerel on this trip, and though she has caught the biggest fish for the day, she is far from being finished. She does not quit easily at this activity and does not easily let me win the biggest fish. Though she is motivated by competition when it comes to fishing, she is also motivated by a love of fish. She sees fish in so many ways, creatures that are sacred and to be appreciated for their unique role in our vast universe, creatures that can be caught for sport and released to grow, or creatures that can feed us so we remain alive. Today she decides we'll keep the fish, cook them up with our guide, and feed the volunteers at a local biomonitoring station. The decision to keep fish is almost always hers to make, as fishing is something she commands when we're together. She seems to know the appropriateness and the when of keeping a fish, and I've learned not to question it. There doesn't seem to be anything mystical about these decisions, but there is a certain intuition she has about keeping fish to eat that I trust. She also prides herself on her use of single hooks and criticizes me endlessly for the plugs I use that consist of a wicked array of double treble hooks. She considers it an unfair advantage on the fish, calls it a form of poaching, and is shameless in her public persecution of me. On a recent trip to the Little Tennessee River near our home in Cowee, North Carolina, I hook a nice smallmouth bass of about 2 pounds, which I work through the shoals to the edge of our canoe, where I attempt to grab the fish by the lip. As I lift the fish into the boat, it makes a final surge of resistance, twisting the one dangling treble hook of my plug through the thin flesh along my right thumb. For several minutes I am fish and man, as I wrestle to free the fish with one hand while my wife watches from the bow of the boat. I know what she is thinking, and she does not say it. Instead, she says, "Did you bring the needle-nose pliers?" I stare at the blood dropping to the floor of the boat in slow rivulets. We are over an hour to the road by boat. No, I didn't. She paddles us to shore to stare at the large hook laced through the tight skin and size. I slowly begin a torturous task of cutting the hook from my thumb with a pocket knife. It is a stunning October day. Cardinal flower and joe pye weed at the apex of their expression provide backdrop as the blood flows and as this beautiful and righteous woman looks on with a mixture of concern and consternation. After a half hour of working the hook out, I take the paddle and we begin our navigation back through the exquisite beauty of the river. We keep no fish. Well, thank you. That's all. I mean, I don't want to. I've been plenty of readings where I just felt like that's enough, man. Just stop, you know. So anyway, so if you have any questions, I'd be happy to entertain any questions or talk. Whatever, we could talk William Bartram. I've got a lot of Bartram in me right now. So there's a lot of Bartram in this book.
Have you been back to that area in the Smokies?
Not since last, no, no. I'm planning a trip with the same guy. He and I have done this trip now. I think I've been to that part of the park now. Has anyone ever been down into Three Forks here? You have? Yeah, you have. Yeah.
I was getting ready to ask you.
Yeah.
I tried to visualize how you went and came up and up the ridge, hooked back down, and came back down, and came back up to McGee Springs.
Yeah.
I asked if that was right.
Yeah, so you know where McGee Springs is, right? So you just drop off down to the East Fork, then you go upstream.
Then upstream.
You go upstream, then you climb Hyatt Ridge. We tried to climb Hyatt Ridge.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
And then you came over to find this thicket branch and came down.
And came back down.
And
Yeah.
caught that and then came back up.
Yeah.
I was trying to work that all.
Yeah, we made it to the one blue line stream on the map, which was Thicket Branch, and then we just dropped down at Thicket Branch, back down to the East Fork.
5 times farther than.
Oh yeah, it was just ridiculous. It's total insanity.
You didn't want to
You
stop
know?
and ask for directions.
No, there's none of that. You know, it was like it was just. I've never experienced anything like it. You know, it was just. If you've ever been in dense rhododendron where you just really are crawling, I mean, there were times when it was easier to actually climb the rhododendron and try to climb across the tops of these rhododendron thickets because it was that dense and it was that old. And it was like,
Huggins Hill section like that where the guy got in there and almost died.
Is that in the park too?
Yeah, it's in the park like that.
Yeah,
And he was in there for days and finally got out.
Wow.
Just trapped with
By himself?
They named that section Huggins Hill.
Yeah. Wow. I would not have done that. You know, my plan, if I had been able to go alone. Seriously, this 94-year-old man, he's a very dear friend of mine. His wife was just diagnosed this past week with acute myeloid leukemia. It's a bone marrow. She's 91. I mean, it's the end. You know, it's the end. And I've been very, very close friends with this couple for many years. But you know, he and I, you know. He just really wanted me to make sure I went with someone. My plan was to go up to McGee Springs, stay 3 days, be alone, drop off down to the East Fork, just hang out on the East Fork, not doing any crazy bushwhacking or anything, but just like sitting around on the East Fork and then climbing McGee Springs back up and having a couple of nights of solitude in the park. And he was just so adamant. You know, he's like, yeah, you cannot go down into there by yourself. And you know, yeah, I mean, I might have really died if I'd gone by myself, even down McGee Springs.
They might have not found you either.
Yeah, because that's just not, you know, it's a really, yep, it's a really, really super remote part of the park.
They got back in there to document the champion.
No. But some of you might know Jess Riddle, young guy that runs Georgia Forest Watch. Jess has explored more of that park's old growth. Probably he and Will Blozan are two of the most important documentarians of the remaining old growth forest in the Great Smokies. They'd been all over it, you know, and Jess knew that area really well, but he'd never been to that champion red spruce. And I mean, it was the biggest red spruce. I mean, there are some monster red spruce in that part of the park, but that was the biggest red spruce I'd seen in that part of the park. And Jess is convinced that I was looking at the national champion red spruce. And that Will Blozan, I don't know if any of you know who Will Blozan is, but Will is probably a little younger than I am, maybe about a decade even. but he's impossible, absolutely impossible to keep up with in the woods. I've never been out with anyone except for Jess, the other young guy I was talking about, who could keep up with him. I mean, yeah, he's just plows through this stuff, just absolutely convinced that he knows what he's trying to get to.
And by that time, you were too adult to hit save waypoint on the GPS?
Well, there was no GPS left.
Oh,
We'd already lost the GPS.
So rhododendron really produces a rash? Or is that?
Everything that I found on the internet, people had been affected by it, but it had been by ingestion. They had been had broken out by ingesting rhododendron accidentally, or just through something stupid. And I had been exposed to it to such a degree that I thought, well, I know I've ingested it. I could remember looking at my headlamp and seeing this thick cloud of like constantly breathing rhododendron dust coming off of the leaves. And I don't know what it was, if it was pollen, or I have no idea. I mean, it wouldn't have been pollen that time of year, but it was just a very thick coating on that rhododendron that I was just knocking off as I pushed through, and I can remember just breathing that stuff in. That's all I can figure it was. It cleared up in about a week. Thomas.
Do you know Rob Messick?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Well, he's another guy that would probably go
Yeah.
in there looking for that tree.
Rob, for all I know, Rob's been in there. I'd be surprised if Rob hadn't been in there. Yeah.
But he'd be a guy to contact to document it or whatever. he
Mhm.
wants to do.
I don't know what's happened with Rob. I haven't seen Rob in years. I heard he moved back to Rutherford County, and
He's still around. He's still
is he?
doing what he does.
Yeah, he's done an amazing amount of work in this area on Old Grove. Yeah. I will say that about this collection, it's called The Changing Blue Ridge Mountains, Essays on Journeys Past and Present. That was not the title I chose for this book. It's to me a little, well, I don't want to say this on Auburn's YouTube channel, but I guess I'll take a huge publisher's risk or whatever. Yeah, right. I wanted to call this book Sublimely Awful Scenes of Power and Magnificence, which is a quote by William Bartram, who, sublimely awful scenes of power and magnificence, which Bartram used. That's what, when Bartram climbed over the Nantahala Mountains, and it's in the book, when Bartram crossed over the Nantahala Mountains and reached the most elevated peak, which everyone assumes was Wyabald, which would have been the most elevated peak, Bartram said, I beheld before me with rapture and astonishment a sublimely awful scene of power and magnificence, mountains piled upon mountains. It's Bartram is pretty central to this collection in many, many ways. And so I really wanted to use something from Bartram for the title, but they felt like that title would have been a little bit too weird and esoteric. So they were after something more generic and geographically appealing, and so I thought, well, damn it, my next book will be called Sublimely Awful Scenes of Power and Magnificence. But they were good to work with. History Press is good press, really good press to work with. Any other questions? Yeah,
I
Tricia.
just wanted to say, I thought you did such an excellent job in weaving the personal kind of soul journey with this physical journey, Brent.
Thank you.
I was just like the whole time. A lot of times I just load off and people start reading for more than a few minutes.
Yeah.
But I was probably following it the whole time.
Well, it's really, there's no way to read that without this extreme intensity on my part. Thank you. It's really hard for me to get through this, and when I read this essay in Franklin, I thought, I've got to get better at reading that essay. I've got to just keep reading that essay until I get that out of my system. The emotion has to get out of my system. It's part of purging that emotion to present this in front of people. It's a painful subject. It's still not, I'm a long way from getting over what happened to me, but, I get better every day on some level. And she encouraged me to read it. I was not going to read that. I thought, no, I don't think I want to read that tonight.
I'm not going to be there. So.
Yeah, exactly. Like, you're not the one's got to drink themselves silly after this to get over it, right? But, yeah, Angela just felt like she understands that. I think she understood. When I sent her a text message driving down, she's like, I said, what am I going to read tonight? She said, you read Pushing Through. And I thought, damn, why do you say that? I can't read something just like totally unrelated to my personal life, something about Bartram or something, It was like, although it's my personal life and William Bartram are pretty intimately connected. like I said, I just spent 3 days teaching a course on Bartram, and the more I immerse myself in the world of William Bartram, the more I realize this guy's like saving my life. It's just I enjoy Bartram so much because Bartram, traveled throughout these mountains throughout western North Carolina, not for long, but throughout the southeastern United States for over 3 years. And was by himself a great deal of the time. I think Bartram, in his own way, suffered with a particular type of melancholia from that, as would have been described during that time. I think Bartram was a pretty shy person, and he was okay being alone most of the time in the woods, but that at times that he was very introspective in his considerations of his own outlook on the world. And he spent 3 years basically in the wilds of the southeastern United States, alone a great deal of the time, and came home from that expedition to Philadelphia and never left, never went farther than a day's trip from Philadelphia in 44 years. And, wrote about vice, he wrote about the vices of ambition and, just greed. And he was an extreme, radical critic of his era that was, way against the views of that particular period in American history. And was invited to go on the Lewis and Clark expedition. Thomas Jefferson tried to convince Bartram to be part of the Lewis and Clark expedition. He was given a chair of botany at the University of Philadelphia and he never even showed up for a meeting. He was admitted to the American Philosophical Society and asked to speak and never did. People sought him out, but he spent his life in quiet contemplation there at Bartram's Gardens. And when he died, he owned the shirt on his back, I think, 2 or 3 shirts maybe, his journals, a few other things, and the family business, was his brother's. Bartram just basically came out of the wilds of the Southeast and had seen how Native American people had lived and had written better about that, better than anyone did at that time, and he was the authority in many ways on Southeastern tribes and traditions, and argued that they were absolutely equal in all respects to Western civilization. So, the more I get, the more people keep asking me to talk about Bartram and do these Bartram workshops, the more that I think, well, damn it, something's going on here. I got to truly learn something from this man's writings and teachings. So, yeah.
What are you writing now that you're excited about?
I was talking to Chris about that. One thing that happened to me after losing my job is the poetry kind of shut down. I had a very tough time putting myself into the type of mind that I need to write poetry. There was just too much internal drama that I couldn't get myself into the space that I used to could get into to find what it takes to kind of stop to write poetry, to kind of really get into the proper frame of mind to let it come out. And yet, the last essay in this book is called "Which Way is the Wilderness," which is I went to England. Several months after I lost my job, I just said to hell with it. I went to England for 2 months. Craziest thing I've ever done in my life is why are you going off and spending money you don't have to spend, knowing that you're coming back and don't have a job? But I didn't care. I had good friends in England and really wanted to go to England and just get out of this funk that I was in. And it was weird. It's as soon as I touched down on British soil and found myself sitting in this wonderful flat in Harrogate, and particularly up in this cottage in Middlesmoor, I was able to write poetry again, And so I had some but I had my own, thoughts that kind of started getting me back into that frame of mind that I needed to be to write poetry. And I sketched out some poems in England that, I'm trying to do something with right now, to just get a chapbook together from that 2-month experience there that was truly healing and cathartic. I've never wanted to not come back from somewhere as much as I did leaving England, because I knew that when I got back from England, I was going to be back in this landscape again, back in this funk again with everything that happened to me, and I was going to be fighting all these demons again. And sure enough, when I got back from England, it just shut down all over again, you know. I still try to write poetry, and I'm still more committed to poetry than I am nonfiction in many ways, but don't mean to offend any, like, total devotees or people who just do nothing but write nonfiction, but nonfiction for me is easier than writing poetry. Poetry to me doesn't come easy. I feel like it's a real commitment to write poetry and to really care about it. And I can sit down and write nonfiction kind of just purgatively or something, you know. And so I've been writing more nonfiction pieces that really just kind of come to me easier. You know, the ideas come, and I'd rather just I can sit down in front of a computer and noodle away on nonfiction stuff. But, you know, with poetry, I have to sit down with a pen and a piece of paper and watch those ideas come out and scratch them off and consider it garbage and throw it away. You know, and that's kind of what I've done with a lot of poetry since coming back.
What about Eskimo?
Been working on him off and on. Wow, that's
Tell these folks about Eskimo.
Eskimo Howl. It's a novel I've been working on since 2013. I like the novel a lot. It's a scary subject because it's about an African-American man who lived in Cowie Valley, who spent a lot of time researching. He's one of the most fascinating characters that you know, I've encountered probably in my life as far as an individual, you know, that just lived a really tough life. You know, African Americans in Appalachia had a much harder time of it, I think, in many ways than coastal African Americans. If you can read some of the WPA narratives online about Appalachian slaves that were recorded in the 30s, you know, when the WPA was trying to collect all of the remaining living slave stories, and they're horrific, you know. And Eskimo lived in my valley, and where I live now, just right up the road from me. You know, just grew up tough. You know, he ran a brothel when he was a young man. He fought in the Battle of the Bulge. He was in World War II. He had a brothel. He had a gambling hall. He ran a bootleg whiskey business. They tried to hang him once, and his aunt saved his life by cutting him down. And I know exactly where that happened. You know, he amassed over 300 acres as an African-American man here in Appalachia. He was a very smart, cunning man. He was a Django of this valley that I lived in. And so I interviewed a lot of people about him, some of the last living people who actually remember him. And then I started writing a novel about him. I think Thomas encouraged me to do that first after I'd written some nonfiction pieces on him. And I spent a lot of time trying to put this novel together. And, you know, I'm probably overly sensitive about some of these things. But, you know, I had a couple of people with different, you know, presses were like, you know, man, you're going out on a limb writing about an African-American man. That's not something that is kind of like, really, you're pushing the limit here. You're setting yourself up to really get charged with cultural appropriation by the wind out of my sails on it. And I don't know where that story's going. I hate it because if it never comes to light, I don't know if that man's life will ever be told, will ever be. I mean, I wrote a fictionalized account of his life, of course, but it's all based on historical, I hope, you know, accuracy and stories that really do have some credibility to them. I mean, I've talked to plenty enough people to believe that what I've interviewed them about is true, you know, because I've heard the same stories from multiple people. It's like interviewing two different crime scene witnesses or something to make sure you get the facts right. But I don't know what's going to happen with that. I love that story. I love that man's life, the fact that he did what he did in a really tough period. But I think I'm going to have to wait till things calm down a little bit out there, because it's like all that's rightfully, you know, I think the literary criticism around that is justified, you know. So it's tough to kind of, you know, 60-year-old white guy writing about an African-American man that lived, you know, 50, 60 years ago. So I want to be sensitive to that. At the same time, I don't know how to tell that story. I want to tell that story. You know, I do want to tell it. I just don't know how to tell it with not having to face what might be retribution, you know. Well, thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.
Yeah, we'll-
Yeah.